So today we will be talking about AI explainability in practice. My name is Morgan Briggs. I am a research associate for data science and ethics in the ethics theme, which is based in the public policy program at the Alan Turing Institute. Today, as I said, I will be discussing the Explaining Decisions Made with AI guidance, which is a co-badge guidance produced by the Information Commissioner's Office and the Alan Turing Institute, and it was released in May 2020. And it is the most comprehensive practical guidance on AI explanation to date. The guidance is divided into three primary parts. The first part is about the basics of explaining AI, followed by a second section, which is about the practical aspects of deploying and developing AI technologies in an explainable manner. And this includes 6 tasks, which help practitioners to do this. And then finally, we have guides for roles and responsibilities within organizations to explain how they can put this guidance into practice. So today, just because of the time constraint, we only have about 55 minutes together. We're going to focus on the explanation-aware design portion of the guidance, and that will form the basis of our conversation today. So for an overview, I'm going to start with the 4 principles of AI explainability, which are detailed in this guidance, followed by process-based versus outcome-based explanations, explanation-aware design, which consists of 6 different explanation types. And then we'll talk a little bit about model choice considerations, which occur across a variety of different cases. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time in this session applying all of these things to a specific case. So as you can probably hopefully see in the chat, Alden has kindly posted a reference document, which contains a little bit more information about the case study we'll be discussing, as well as some further information that will be really nice to hand during the second part of this presentation. Great. So diving into the 4 principles of AI explainability. These 4 principles are related to providing explanations to AI-assisted decisions, but they also complement data protection principles laid out in the GDPR. So starting with be transparent, this complements the GDPR principle of lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And this is about being truthful with when you are using AI systems and also delivering this in a clear and accessible way. Then we have be accountable, which relates to the GDPR principle of accountability. And this is about making sure that along the way, we have roles and responsibilities set up so that we have proper oversight and that we can explain our processes also in a way that demonstrates that we have assigned responsibility throughout the entire life cycle. Then we have consider context, which is kind of what it sounds, but it's also about considering setting, considering place, and also in terms of explanation, considering who you're giving the explanation to, what type of explanation would benefit that impacted individual in the best way. And then we have reflect on impacts. So thinking about the possible benefits, the possible negative aspects of deploying an AI-assisted decision-making system. Great. Next, we will go into process-based versus outcome-based explanation. So as I said, when we're delivering explanations based off of an AI-assisted decision, there are multiple ways we can craft this explanation, which deals a lot with context, deals a lot with the individual, and also deals a lot with the system itself. So when we talk about process-based versus outcome-based, we're talking about 2 different ways to craft this explanation. So process-based is demonstrating that you have followed good governance processes and best practices throughout the entire ML/AI lifecycle. So an example of this is if we wanted to demonstrate fairness and safety of a particular AI-assisted decision, we need to ensure that throughout the entire process, we have set adequate measures in place to ensure that at the end of the outcome, the system is itself fair and safe. Whereas outcome-based is more about clarifying the results, clarifying the outcome of a specific decision. So this is about explaining the reasoning behind a particular algorithmically generated outcome, once again, in plain, easily understandable, and everyday language, which is something you'll see emphasized throughout all of our works, is this idea of explaining to non-technical audiences in a way that is accessible to them. And then finally, for outcome-based, we also want to focus on how and why human judgment that is assisted by an AI output was reached. So you can see the difference between these 2 different approaches to explanation. Now we're going to get into what we call explanation-aware design, which forms a pretty significant part of the explaining decisions made with AI guidance. And we lay out 6 primary types of explanation. And the way to think about this is that they can all be crafted together to form one explanation, but sometimes depending on the context, depending on the system, and depending on the stakeholders involved, one of the explanation types may be best to lead with because it may provide that clarity and that reassurance that maybe is lacking on the part of the data subject who's wondering how this decision was reached. So we'll go through the 6. We'll start with rationale, then we'll go to responsibility and data, then fairness, then safety and performance, followed by impact. So beginning with rationale, this is the why of an AI decision. So here with rationale, we're demonstrating how the system performed and behaved to get to a decision outcome. This includes every decision along the way, including how inputs were transformed to outputs, the underlying logic of the algorithm, how we selected the model type, all of these things that can help us understand the underlying logic of the system itself, and ensure also that we're conveying this as easily understandable reasons to decision recipients. So this is usually a really great explanation type to start with because it gives kind of the overarching structure and underlying logic of the system itself. And rational explanation is particularly useful for challenging a decision and changing behavior. So next we have responsibility explanation, which is the who of an AI decision. So we just had the why, now we have the who. Who is involved in the development and management of the AI model, and who do we contact for human review of the decision? We also want to know who is accountable. So if something were to happen, who do we go to and say, hey, why did the system output this specific outcome for this individual? And demonstrating human involvement and development and implementation of the model. This is particularly useful for challenging a decision and providing information. So now that we've done the why and the who, we're going to go to the what, data explanation. What data about individuals were used in a particular AI decision? So you'll see all of the following questions have to do with the data. How was the data collected, recorded, or acquired? How is data quality assessed? And then we go into more pre-processing feature engineering type of questions. How is data pre-processed, labeled, or augmented? And then a really important question, which we should always ask ourselves in the project lifecycle throughout, is the data representative, relevant, accurately measured, and generalizable, along with being free from potential bias or discrimination? And data explanation is particularly useful for challenging a decision and providing reassurance. So now we've done the why, who, and what. We're now going to go into fairness explanation, which, as you'll see in the handout, we're going to focus mostly on fairness explanation today to apply to the case, but all 6 explanation types are very important and we'll also be discussing them. So just highlighting that we're going to focus on this one just a little bit more today. Fairness explanation has to do with ensuring that AI decisions are generally unbiased and equitable. And these considerations, as the other considerations for the explanation types, must be present throughout the entire AI ML lifecycle. And to really drill down into fairness explanation, we've actually subdivided it into 4 more kind of granular, if you will, explanations of fairness. So we have data set, design, outcome, and implementation fairness, which we're about to get into. But fairness explanation as a whole is useful for challenging a decision and increasing trust and confidence in an AI system. So as I said, we're going to go a little bit more detail here. We have data set fairness. Is data representative, sufficient, up-to-date, recorded through reliable sources of measurement, and relevant? Then we have design fairness, which is more about the model architecture, including the target variables, features, processes, or analytical structures. Are they unreasonable or unjustifiable? So an example here is when we're grouping features or grouping variables together. Are we grouping them in a way that could exacerbate existing historical inequalities by perhaps leaving off a group, by aggregating them into a group that perhaps has a less descriptive name or combines lower numbers of everything into one? Is that helpful for promoting fairness and promoting equality in that way? Then we have outcome fairness. Does the model have discriminatory or inequitable impacts on the lives of people it affects? And were you explicit about your chosen fairness metric? And then finally, we have implementation fairness. Is the model deployed by users who are sufficiently trained to implement it responsibly without bias? So we want to avoid automation bias and over-reliance on AI systems, but also an under-reliance too. There's a balance. So we need to consider these things in implementer and user training. And are the results interpreted within their specific context? So this goes back to this overarching principle of AI explainability of consider context. Great, next we'll move on to safety and performance explanation. So this is about detailing the measures we have in place and will continue to take to maximize accuracy, reliability, security, and robustness of the decisions of the AI model. These are questions like, how did you measure accuracy? Why did you choose these measures? What kinds of external validation were taken? How do you manage the security of confidential and private information? And have you stress tested the system to understand how it responds to adversarial intervention? So just to note, these are not this is not an exhaustive list of questions. This is just to highlight those considerations of accuracy, reliability, security, and robustness of the system. And this is useful for challenging a decision and providing information and reassurance. And then the sixth, definitely not the least of these, is the impact explanation, which is demonstrating an understanding of the potential effects of AI systems on individuals. So how did we consider the potential effects and take steps to mitigate possible negative ones while amplifying positive ones? And very importantly, how do you plan to monitor and reassess impacts once deployed? So how do we ensure that it started off doing something and then maybe 2 or 3 months in, or even shorter or longer, it's doing something completely different, maybe because the context changed, the data type changed, various other considerations. How do we ensure that these impacts that we once intended remain the same throughout? And this is useful for providing reassurance and explaining consequences. Great, so now that we've covered the 6 explanation types very quickly, rapidly through this so we can get to the bit of hearing from you, we will talk a little bit about model choice considerations. So these are considerations that are across many different use cases, but things to think about. So purpose specification, what are we using this model for? Are we repurposing the model and data from something else? Could that have consequences if we're applying it to a completely different context? Who will be deploying the models? This goes back to this user implementer training, the importance of that. What type of training, once again, is necessary to effectively use the model of choice? Then we need to obviously always consider the potential impacts on individual lives, which links back to this impact explanation. And can you describe how the model reaches outcome for a specific data point? So thinking if a data subject came and said, I have this outcome and I want to know how my inputs translated to this outcome, could we give that to that individual? And how important is this for your use case? Thinking about safety critical versus perhaps less safety dependent examples. And then we have the interpretability accuracy trade-off, which comes when we choose which model to take, whether we choose a simpler model or a more complex model. Great, so now we're going to dive into this case study. So this will be the focus of the remainder of this session. We have a link in the chat which links to a PDF which has more detail on this. Since we only have about an hour together, we're going to share as many details as we can about the case study, but also provide you with the tools to contribute. So that PDF has not only more information about the case study, but it also has the key points of the fairness explanation, which is what we're going to be focusing on. So in the case study, you'll find that there's description of an AI-assisted HR recruitment tool. So the motivation for this case study is that this is a real example of how AI is deployed in an HR setting. And there are obviously many, many considerations involved in not only the model construction and deployment, but also throughout the entire life cycle, including but not limited to fairness, effectiveness, the importance of human involvement in that decision, and the impact on individual lives, as these are individuals applying to jobs that deserve the utmost respect and dignity. So to introduce the case, the end goal is an AI-assisted recruitment tool to assist with future job vacancies. And the system will look at certain traits and criteria that it determines, and then will invite eligible candidates to interview. And the goal of this is to provide value and save time for the company that is described in the case due to hundreds of applications received for each job posting. So we have a lot of different considerations, which is laid out in that PDF, as well as a list of features, which I'll cover really quickly before we jump in. There are different model considerations in multiple data types. There's numeric data, there's textual data, There's many different features we could choose from: demographic data, general questions about skills and experience, and salary preferences, as well as CV and an expression of interest. There are also many trade-offs in terms of performance, interpretability, and explainability. Which model type do we use? Do we go for a simpler model to allow for perhaps more interpretability, but perhaps lower performance? How do we determine and weigh these things? And then also, the model training will be completed using over 6,000 past applications from within that company. So there are processes that were used within this specific company, and they're being used to train this new model. However, one of the colleagues in the firm notifies everyone that the data may not actually be standardized anymore because things have changed since they first started collecting data 6 years ago, and the industry standards are different. So how do we weigh all of these considerations when thinking about how to give an explanation? So just to briefly do this, and then we'll jump in. This is a list of features. This is in the PDF in the chat if you want to look at this a little bit more closely. But this is just a list of possible features we could use if we determine to build a model for an AI-assisted recruitment system. So we have things like salary preference, number of past roles, list of skills, degree outcome, gender, race, ethnicity, and some other prompt questions. This is what this company has decided. This hypothetical company in our case study has decided that these may be good possible features for determining the outcome that they stated. Great. So for next steps, we're going to now proceed to using Mural. So for those who may not be familiar, this is basically an online whiteboard, which I believe Alden is going to place the link in the chat if she hasn't already. Sorry, I can't see the chat and the presentation at the same time. But we have 2 questions, and we're going to start with one question, which is, what are the main concerns raised by the AI-assisted HR recruitment tool for explanation-aware design? So I'll switch to share my screen just to show everyone, if you're not familiar with Mural, how you can contribute. But we'd love to hear from all of you on this. This is going to be an interactive session. All of you, please feel free to contribute. All you should usually have to do is double click and it'll pull up a little sticky, and then you just start typing and it'll automatically start typing. So we're going to focus on the left-hand side of the screen, the first board that says, what are the main concerns raised by the AI-assisted HR recruitment tool? And then we'll move to the second question, which is right below it. So which explanation types would you choose in this case? And then once we do that for about 15 minutes, we're going to move to another board. So I will let you know, and I'll stop sharing my screen for now. Great. Great. If we're having any link issues and anyone wants to put anything in the chat, if you want to put it in the chat, I'm also happy to type it for you. Great. And I will share my screen so everyone can see.
Morgan, is the link working for you? It seems like not everyone's able. It does work for me.
Yeah, it works for me. Yes, I can share my screen too, so we can do it. If they can't access, I'll share my screen, and then we can make sure we add their contributions if there's.
Okay, it sounds like a few people might be having some issues, but yeah, so if you can share the screen, that would be great. Oh, there's plenty of people in there, so that's great.
Yeah.
I'll get out of here.
Great. Great. So yes, please keep adding to the first 2 boards on the left-hand side. And then once we do this, we'll find a way to allow those who want to say a little bit more about their sticky notes to contribute. Sorry to those who are having a firewall access problem, but if you would like to put something in, please message, and I'm happy to type it for you. And thank you to all who are contributing. So just a reminder for those who might be joining, if you just double click and start typing, it should work. And you can change the size of your square too if you want to make it smaller, bigger.
Morgan?
Yes.
This is a Mural board.
Yeah, this is what Mural really intended when they launched this product. Amazing. Thank you all so much for contributing. So we'll just give it a few more minutes on the left-hand boards. We're just focusing on the left-hand boards for now, but it's okay if you've added to the other one. Oop. Oh no, did we lose a frame? Okay. Great, so we'll start looking through these in a minute. So if you would like to, okay, great. Is that one for the, I think for a sticky, I'll add that. I assume this is for this, but if it's not, we have a good concept in the board that we can discuss at a later date. Awesome, that's great, thank you. Okay, great. So if there, I'll start kind of reading through some of the ones for everyone, just in case those who can't access Mural can't see it or can't see my screen. But then for those who want to speak a little bit more about one of their points, I believe, Alden, the best way is for them to request video access. Is that correct, Alden?
Yes. So if
Okay,
you
great.
click on the request to share audio and video, you'll basically get in a queue, and I can let people in. So Morgan, just tell me when you want me to start opening up the discussion.
Great, yeah. So we'll go through a few of these, and then like Alden said, if you would like to contribute, maybe if I say a few points and that's something that you really want to add on, please request to share. I believe you can decide if you want to share your audio or both, and feel free to feed in on what you said. That we want to make this as collaborative as possible. It's a little hard with 172 people, but we're trying our best, and Mural definitely is getting its exercise here. So great. So let's think. We have, what are the main concerns raised by the AI-assisted HR recruitment tool? We have things like the tool is relying on past data that could exacerbate existing gender racial bias. We have more repeated comments about bias inherent in past recruitment practice data. Past experience of an individual isn't an indicator of their future potential. Yeah, so these are all related to this use of past data. We have a lot of bias in the data, model overfitting. Overly complex models will make decisions based on factors which may not be easily explainable. So once again, an overfitting complexity question. We have training data is likely to have unknown biases. It'd be interesting to see if anyone wants to come in on that and explain a little bit more what they mean by that. Yep, the right to decision explanation to the candidate. Yep. Which is hopefully what the explanation types would help with, but these are good straight up considerations. Protected characteristics in data set, which may be recoverable from the model. These are all really interesting considerations. Does someone want to come in on any of these points? Maybe the anything about, there's been a few about the training data is likely to have unknown biases.
So I can't really tell who wants to talk about what, but okay. I'm just going to let them in the order which they've asked.
Yeah, that's
perfect. I can let multiple people in too.
Sure, yeah. We'll let a few in, and then maybe we can just go from person to person. That might be the best way.
Okay, great.
Okay. Welcome all. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Great. So we have Adam and Peter. Do one of you want to come in on any of these points for the first board?
Yes, so I'd like to talk about the unconscious biases in the training data. So obviously it's been highlighted that quite often in these situations there will be sort of sex and race bias because we live in a society that still has these biases. But there's also a lot that you won't necessarily recognize. So if you're training, if you're just looking at past employers of your company and your company is UK based, then from Cambridge and Oxford you might have loads of great applicants, so you're looking for those universities, but that might discriminate against people that were educated in really good universities in other countries. And also Cambridge and Oxford are very overrepresented by sort of people from very affluent backgrounds, very overrepresented by white people that went to private schools. So there's a lot there that, even if it's not necessarily a bias, that people recognize that there's a lot that people wouldn't necessarily think about that would still significantly affect a lot of applicants to a particular job.
Yeah, thank you for that, Adam. Those are really important considerations. Thanks for elaborating on that. Thanks. Peter, do you want to add something?
One thing that I was thinking about that's which is a practical difficulty of providing explanations is, especially with respect to like statistical biases in the data, is that often the only way that you can figure out what statistical biases model, like there's no universally applicable method that you could say, like, here are the statistical biases in the data, and then I'll take it into account when I use them, when I train a model. Usually you have to train the model to figure out what statistical biases it will pick up on. And consequently, like, even identifying that, like, if you get a data set, even identifying those biases, like, there are some that you can identify, but often if they're more complicated, like they're multiple variables that you have to take into account together, then figuring out what those are is like very hard to do. So I guess maybe it's not super useful to the discussion, but it's just that it's a really hard problem, because it's like you almost have to choose the model in order to figure out what statistical biases it's going to pick up on. But then, you know, there's a million models you can choose from. So how do you it just becomes an incredibly large search space, which is really hard to make progress in.
Yeah, no, you make very good points, Peter, and also the issue we're talking about maybe not seeing biases up front when you're just looking at the data source. This is a lot to do with lurking proxies and all of those things, which I think people have pointed out, but we may not always know those at first glance. So I think you make a lot of interesting points about that. And David, I don't know if you want to come in at all on any of this.
Yeah, on Peter's point, I mean, I would just stress that one thing to remember is bias mitigation is a process of continuous kind of iteration and assessment. And so clearly there will be a need for, you know, moving back and forth between data and model, and really also working with tools of visualization. So ways that you can actually see, you know, how the features are relating to one another at different points in the development of the model. And so I guess the recommendation would be, there's going to be no silver bullet here, right? That's going to allow us to identify the kind of statistical biases and the other biases that kind of are coming up. But what we can do is to have a very deliberate process of bias self-assessment and means by which critical reflection can be integrated into the model development, the training, testing, validating, all of those processes. And I just like to stress actually that brings up a wider point about this approach to explanation, which is that in some sense, we need to think about explanation holistically. So all of these choices that are being made are within socio-technical contexts, and it's not just sort of technical choices between a particular set of models that may be more or less explainable. These are choices that are kind of integrating human preferences, human needs, and human purposes into the technology itself. And so as much sort of critical reflection as we can introduce into those processes, it's all the better. And if I could quickly make one more point about the previous speaker, and that's that we need to really make a distinction between the historical biases that got drawn into a data set and the ways in which those historical biases that exist in society out beyond the data, right, that are then kind of, we would say, baked into the data, right? There's a need to really have good visibility on that. And what does that require? Well, it requires more than just the kind of technical expertise that one would need to sort of, build out a really sort of clean, well-annotated data set. You need domain knowledge, you need interdisciplinary understanding just of the ways, like the explanation of how you have, white private school kids usually populating places like Cambridge and Oxford. That's kind of an obvious, maybe to some that's kind of an obvious thing that would be baked into the data set, but there are so many other subtle factors that need to be sort of scrutinized and identified. And so looking at historical biases really requires that type of contextual understanding and that domain knowledge, in addition to then the kind of more socio-technical and technical knowledge that's involved in bias mitigation once we're in the kind of design development and deployment lifecycle.
Yeah, definitely echo David's points there, that these are all in a wider socio-technical system in terms of the considerations that we need to have that aren't always technical. And I think some of these comments, I'm just looking through a few of them, get at that as well with historical bias. Challenges about how you define a good candidate is also a really interesting point. If it's based on previous hires, then you limit the talent pool because based on characteristics of your current workforce, and therefore may exacerbate diversity issues, particularly industries such as STEM, which traditionally have clear gaps in diversity in the workforce. So that's a very interesting point and kind of tags off of what David just said as well. Yeah, so there's a lot of really good points in here. I know it's already 9:34, so maybe let's go to the second question. If those of you who haven't added want to add, the question is, which explanation types would you choose in this case, and how would you prioritize them? So just looking first, we have rationale, fairness, impact, safety. We have fairness, rationale, again, fairness, all of them, question mark. Yep. Let's see, data completeness, reliability. Yeah, that goes into data explanation. Nice. Great. I'll give a few more seconds for people to add in explanation types. We will be focusing on fairness explanation type, not to say that is the only one you should use in this case. There's considerations from all of them to take into account, but we chose fairness because we think it's obviously applicable, but also we only have 55 minutes with you, so we couldn't go into all of them. But I'll let everyone leave a few more comments on that, and then we'll move our way to the last board on the far right. Just making sure everyone has access to the reference document as well, because in there we lay out the sub points of the fairness explanation, and that might be helpful to have to hand so you can think of things related to fairness explanation, as for some of you this might be the first time you're seeing it. Thanks, Alden. Great. So maybe we'll come back to this, but let's move to the far right board. So now we're asking, how does fairness explanation apply to this case? So we've presented this in the presentation, but we also have the sub-points of the different considerations you should have as an organization in terms of how to ensure that fairness explanation is there from start to finish so that you're able to give those explanations in that way. So feel free to comment on the far right board. We're in Mural. For those who might just joined us, there's a link to join the Mural board, and there's a reference doc pinned at the top.
Morgan, one thing I'd like to add about the that second question, and just looking at the entries. Sure. I think one that I don't see and that I think would be important is impact explanation, and I think it's important because a lot of the post-its on the first question really suggest concerns about the application itself, right? I mean, in a sense, so impact explanation really is about coming in at the earliest entry point in a design process. So even before one kind of defines the problem, even before one defines a target variable, and to ask the questions like, how is this system going to potentially impact affected people, affected individuals and communities? And impact explanation just involves making explicit the process by which an organization goes through in order to carry out that type of assessment or evaluation. And I think that this use case about specifically applying a particular set of machine learning techniques to decision making that has to do with life options for people, right? The capacity of people to explore new careers, perhaps, or the capacity of a person who's been out of a career, maybe taking care of a family for a while, to re-enter into a career. And what's brought up here is, should we have a system, for instance, that is predicting patterns of success based upon patterns that have been successful? Should that be determining the life options of that person who might be an anomaly in that world? And that's an impact question, right? Do we care about the agency dimension of those people being able to, you know, explore new paths, for instance, in light of the way this application might be used and the way they might be filtered out from opportunities? And so that's just to say, it is really, you know, it's a real essential component of, even when we think of fairness explanation, to think about the impacts. It's the impact of the explanation types are very interrelated in some ways, but this is just one that really needs to be stressed in the use case.
Yeah, I definitely agree, David. And I think that has to deal with the fact that also, as we discussed in the impact explanation in the presentation too, that obviously all data subjects everywhere deserve the utmost respect and dignity when understanding why a decision was made about their data. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think sometimes because there's new vocabulary too, is that people probably mean impact explanation, but because we just threw all these terms, it's nice to point out that should definitely be there. Agreed. We have some comments in the chat too. We have someone is pointing out a case study about statistical bias where they tried to pilot a program that used AI to make bail decisions, and the designers explicitly removed race as an input to the model. These are definitely considerations that come up a lot. Yeah.
I see there's a question about does that apply to all recruitment activity? And I guess what I would say is, one of the, this is perhaps a bigger picture way to look at it, but I think one of the benefits of really being deliberate about explanation when it comes to technical systems, machine learning and AI systems, is that it creates strengthened processes of reflection within the context of our everyday practices anyway. And so to the question, does this sort of apply to all recruitment activity? I would say yes. In fact, one of the value addeds about going through processes like this is that it really does bring perspective. It brings critical perspective to all of the choices that we're making. In the same way that, for instance, encouraging public engagement, right, in the design, development, deployment of AI systems brings a dimension of kind of democratic practice, right, into ways of working that might not have been opened up to democratic governance and democratic practices. I would say it's the same thing with impact assessment and thinking about providing a kind of impact explanation.
Great, so maybe shall we move on to the fairness explanation, David? Do you think? Yeah, cool. Great, so here we have, how does fairness explanation apply to this case? So let's start looking through outcome aspect of fairness explanation, in particular, potential for harm if individuals are discriminated against in the application process. Evaluation criteria are based on sound defensible standards. Example, years of experience, how relevant to the position. How does it recognize unfairness? Yeah, thank you to those also who are calling out the specific subcategories of fairness. That's awesome. And that's in the reference document for those who may have missed it. Thank you, Alden. Alden's on it this morning. Claps for Alden. So yes, design fairness, showing that the features used are reasonable. How does this automated system handle uncertainty, qualifications that are good but do not map clearly onto the model's criteria? It's an interesting question. The HR company will need to have thorough explanations available for legal purposes. Yeah, there is overlap with GDPR as well in terms of the right to an explanation. Great. How would the system evaluate cases like someone having a gap in career and returning to work? Yeah, that's also tagging off of what David said also about different life events that take place. How does the model account for that? Explainable decision, yep. It needs to be explained what fairness means in this case. Yeah, and that definitely has to, that links a little bit back to the outcome fairness in terms of which fairness metrics were used and why. So that's exactly that. Does anyone want to come in on any of these points? And yeah, I think you can just request video or audio. You can come join us at the video part. There we go. Hello. I'm not sure. I think, Peter, do you have another comment? Or are you?
Well, I just was asking, when does a candidate have a right to an explanation?
That's a good question. I mean, I could take a crack at this, but David is the expert on this. But I'm happy to come in. Or David, what do you think?
Go for it, Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question because I think you have to get to the part to which the system is deployed, because obviously until it's deployed, candidates would not necessarily know the inner workings of it. But I would say anytime that you come into contact with an AI system, which you should be notified, I mean, this company should make clear that they're using some form of AI-assisted recruitment tool, which has to do with the be transparent portion of explainability. They should know that they've come into contact, and then they should be able to request an explanation for that decision once it has been given to them. So if they have a, I think in the case we say it produces an automated email response to them, the system does. So once they receive that email says you were not chosen to interview, maybe there should be some disclaimer that an algorithm was used in this decision. At that point, I think the candidate should definitely be able to contact the organization and say, how is this decision made about me? Yeah, hopefully that's clear.
But one thing I'm thinking is that employers, especially at that phase where you're just rejecting based on application, don't usually provide an explanation. And if you ask for one, usually won't give one. So in a way, we're holding the AI algorithm that they use to a higher standard than we hold them to. And so because the AI algorithm is within the company and the company has this discretion, how could you force them to hold their AI algorithm to a higher standard than they hold themselves?
I mean, I think there are clearly gaps and important weaknesses in the idea of the right to an explanation in GDPR. And I mean, taking a robust approach to it, I think is probably most wise, in the sense that there are legal issues about discrimination that arise if you have a filtering mechanism that has no human review, that's just filtering out applications, right? This is a big, it should raise a lot of red flags, right? In terms of the sort of holding the AI to a different standard, I think it's important to not sort of, for me at least, it's important to not put one right next to the other, because in a sense, human decision making, if there's a candidate who doesn't sort of get through on an application process and wants to appeal for some reasoning for that, they should be able to appeal to a recruitment department to ask, do you have feedback? Can you give me any pointers, et cetera? And so I would say that there is a burden there on the human side, but I would also say there's an additional burden on the side of the technical system, because that system can't of itself provide reasoning behind its output, and that's why the interpretive moment of us coming in and being able to say, well, this is the relative feature importance, this seems like what the prediction was all about, et cetera. This is why it's especially important that you have a kind of intervention of an explanation there. But just to say, I think that you're right. I think that in practice, it's not seen as a right to an explanation, generally speaking. And so in practice, I think what you're saying reflects reality.
I'm not sure the order because it's hard to keep track, but I think it might be UC's, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
I just wanted to raise the question whether this is a great example because it raises the question whether it's ethical at all to use AI for this question, right? So we live in a world so far where we've already decided that we can do it and we should do it. But this is to the question: is there an explanation? We say we're explaining that we haven't done this because it's not ethical to do this. What do you think?
That's a really interesting and great point. And I think this is something that we stress in our team as well throughout the ML AI lifecycle. We have a stage that's called problem formulation and project planning, where we think about whether technology is even necessary and or helpful in this case, and will it perhaps produce more harms than good. And this is exactly what you're referring to. This should be a conversation amongst the organization of weighing all of these impacts and weighing whether or not the usual procedures and the usual methodologies of human involvement are still more suitable than an AI system. And you're exactly right. That should be a conversation way at the beginning before you're even considering the model type, anything. It should we use technology at all in this case? And will it perhaps produce or exacerbate more inequalities than the already existing system?
Yeah, or even, yeah, because it goes back to sort of Peter's point that yes, we do hold AI to a higher standard, and we should hold AI to a higher standard because the authors and the rationale behind it have disappeared in sort of the development process. So AI has to have them. And so therefore we could say, well, actually in this case, we'd rather have the human arbitrary decision than the machine arbitrary, than the pretends of machine decision. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and one quick thing to add to this is just, an organization should just be transparent about the rationale of taking up and using a system, or not deciding to use the system. Because at the end of the day, what these processes are doing is they're allowing for reasonable expectations to be exchanged between an organization and those that organization's activities are impacting. And that this idea of building kind of a set of reasonable expectations between people, that's what we call social trust. That's how social trust is defined. And so from a practical ethics point of view, these processes of transparent kind of reporting and about rationales, in terms of engaging a technology, these are just part of building kind of relationships of social trust amidst the use of technology.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Melina is next. If you want to unmute, feel free.
Hi. Yes, no, I came late to the session, so forgive me if you've already covered this. I'm really interested in how much human readers actually so the AI is used to assist human readers. How much are humans biased by actually the AI? So if they were to make a decision on their own back without any AI inputs, would they come and would their decision change if the AI was inputting? Is there any research on that?
In terms of the biases that are associated with human involvement in an outcome, that has been studied in the sense that there's kind of over-reliance or under-reliance on AI systems decisions. So whether you put more weight in the AI output and say that, yes, this is perhaps in scare quotes more objective than my decision because it's a technical system, that's kind of perhaps one extreme point of view. And then the other one is that, perhaps there's no way that a technological system could approach human judgment in that sense. So there are different studies in terms of those two different types of biases that are kind of at either end of that. But yes, I do think there are probably studies ongoing. I would welcome anyone in the chat to put any links to that. But in terms of that as a focal point, it's not my area of expertise in terms of how kind of humans put themselves in position to AI-assisted outputs. But David, I don't know if you have any further information on studies related to how humans kind of see their judgments related to those of AI-assisted decisions. I don't know if you dropped off, but I talked about the two different bias types. But yeah, I welcome anyone in the chat as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think just quickly, I missed some of it because yes, my internet went insane. So yes, I mean, I think that this is in the little case study, we have this category of implementation fairness, which has to do with like the cognitive biases, right, that might arise in the interaction between the system and their own decision making. So are they going to over rely or over comply with recommendations in virtue of the supposed objectivity or neutrality of a statistical output, right? Or are they going to dismiss what might be a more hypothetically fair decision because they have their own kind of professional experience that they prioritize over the the support of the system. And so, yeah, I think that there's a vast literature on this kind of sets of cognitive biases that arise as we interact with the technologies. And I think that area is where that's the tree that we need to bark up. We need to really understand the subtle cognitive biases that emerge as we relate to the kind of the numbers and the machinery.
Thank you. No, I look at medical imaging and there's a big over-reliance bias in medical screening. So I'm interested to see how it works with bias in other area. If anyone has any recommendations of papers, please can they put them in the chat? I would be really grateful. Thank you very much.
Amazing. I think we have time for one last question. I think, who do we have left? Okay, so Peter's gone. Melina Olanrawaju, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Yes,
okay,
I am.
Great. Yeah, please go ahead if you have a question.
No, I don't have a question. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. All good. Great. So we have a few minutes left. Does anyone else want to comment or add any last questions? I think does the session end at 55, Alden, or do we have our 5 minutes?
You can keep going. I'll have to jump into my next session, but yeah, no reason to stop you guys early. There's a really great chat going on here. I know there were some questions earlier, but unfortunately we don't have a Q&A section, so they're kind of lost in the chat. So if anyone has something they want to bring up, maybe they can either pop it back in the chat or ask to unmute and ask one last question.
Yes, we do have a question. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Well, one question that one of the reasons that I've been wondering is I feel like there's a huge disconnect between like the main modeling paradigm right now that's being developed in industry, in my opinion, is like deep neural networks, which are very unexplainable. Like there are explainability methods, but they provide like there's no theoretical guarantees related to them, and they are they're very opaque. And then there's this like amazing framework which you proposed, or that's out there for thinking about developing models which are fair. But there's, I think, like a huge disconnect in the sense that like we're developing these deep learning models all the time without a consideration of this, and the economic value of it is so great that I don't think like people are going to stop and say like, well, let's take a couple years to figure out how to make them fair. So I'm just wondering, how do you create this? How do you come closer in terms of these two different directions of like opaque deep learning models versus actually having fair algorithms deployed in practice?
I mean, my feeling is you're bringing up a really important point that exists in reality, and we're living through this period. We're still living through the move fast and break things period, right? Where it's just so the benefits for some are so great that there isn't sort of deliberate approaches being taken to things like sufficient interpretability in light of potential discrimination, issues like that. That being said, I mean, I think that one of the first steps towards maybe being more responsible about this is having a sufficient awareness of the kind of data that's being processed, right? So, deep neural nets are great for high dimensional feature spaces, right? So, computer vision and, other sensory functions. But when we're thinking about processing social and demographic data, data that can be represented in a tabular way, that clearly have issues that need to be properly explained in terms of the potential human impacts, then is it right to reach for the opaque model when there's a high level of potential discrimination? No, it's not. I mean, and in the ICO Turing explainability guidance, we explicitly say, like, if you're processing social and demographic information, it shouldn't be an option to reach for an opaque model when there are potentials for that to cause discrimination or inequity. And so I think we need to move in that direction. But as you're saying, we're not there yet.
You guys, this has been fabulous. I'm trying to leave without closing down the room, but it seems to want to make me close the room. But I think Kate is here, so it's still live. So I'm going to take off, but I think you guys can keep chatting. I know everyone has busy lives, so Morgan and David, call it whenever you're ready. But thank you everyone so much. This has been really, really fabulous. Thanks for your participation.
Great, thanks, Alden. And in case Alden does leave and the session goes down, feel free to find us on the Turing page. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll try my best to field as many emails as possible. You can find my profile on the Turing website. My last name's Briggs, Briggs. So feel free to shoot me an email. But thank you all so much for your participation. This board is really great. I'm going to keep it and look at it because I think there's a lot of really interesting insights there. So thank you all for your contributions, and hope you enjoy the rest of AIUK. There's a lot of great sessions on. We, shameless plug, I suppose, that we're presenting on our work with the Global Partnership on AI this afternoon. So please do join us there. It should be a very interesting conversation and panel. So thank you all again. Great to see you all, and have a lovely rest of your week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thank you.